So welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all here. I'm Eric Jenkinson, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Head of the College of Medical and Dental Sciences, where you are sat now in the Leonard Deacon Theatre, Lecture Theatre, which is where we do some of our medical student teaching, but we're looking forward to something rather different this evening, although I guess in the fullness of time, robotics will take over medicine, so we'll all be out of a job. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome Jeremy's family, his parents, Janet and David, brother John, sister Vicky, and his wife Mihaela. So welcome especially to you, but welcome to everyone. Now, the lecture we're about to hear is part of the university's inaugural lecture series, and these inaugural lectures are a bit of a rite of passage for all professors that when they first take up their appointment. And they're interesting lectures. They can be a little bit of a challenge to make accessible to the interesting to the expert and accessible to the non-expert. And this lecture in particular is also one of the many events that are going on in EU Robotics Week, in which robotics labs across Europe disseminate their work to the general public. So for today's purposes, I'm certainly part of the general public, so I'm looking forward to being educated in this topic. And for that reason, we're also live streaming this lecture to make it available to the wider world. Now, before we get into the lecture itself, just something about Jeremy, who is, of course, Professor of Robotics and Artificial Intelligence here in Birmingham. So Jeremy graduated with a degree in Theology and Religious Studies from Bristol in 1990. He then spent a year in student politics. I don't know whether that involved any sit-ins or not, but that's what he did. And he ended up in artificial intelligence, I'm told by accident. He went to Sussex to study for an MSc in knowledge-based systems in 1991, and then on to Edinburgh in 1992, where he did research for his PhD on active information gathering during learning, and that was work supervised by Gillian Hayes and John Hallam. So he made the move south again when he joined the School of Computer Sciences here in 1997, first as a temporary lecturer for 9 months or so, but eventually he stayed here for 18 years. So not quite as long as me, but he's catching up. And I'm told when he first arrived, he was known to sleep in his office and carry a toothbrush to lectures. I'm sure his mother will be really proud of him to hear that. Of course, these days, I'm sure health and safety would probably frown on such activity, although I know there's a few people still do it. Now, along with many others, Jeremy has worked hard to grow work in artificial intelligence and robotics here in Birmingham, and particularly since 2003, when he started work with Aaron Sloman and Nick Hawes on a project in computer sciences called COSY. I'm sure we'll find out what that's about in a little while. But this has included leading and participating in a variety of research projects on different aspects of robots, including artificial intelligence planning for robots, architectures, robot learning, machine learning, and robot manipulation. He also helped Glyn Humphreys and Chris Mile establish the Centre for Computational Neuroscience and Cognitive Robotics in 2010, and that's had a significant impact, bringing a number of excellent researchers to Birmingham to work on computational models of human and robot behaviour. So in this lecture, Jeremy is going to explain some of the changes taking place in robotics and artificial intelligence, and obviously some of the work that's been done here in Birmingham and some of the likely future that we have to look forward to. So on that point, I would now like to invite Professor Wyatt to give his inaugural lecture entitled Robot Life, a User's Manual. Jeremy.
Hello. So, As Professor Jenkinson said, this is a part, not only an inaugural, but it's also an event in EU Robotics Week. So if you're interested in robotics, you can go to the EU Robotics Week website and find out lots more activities, including, at the moment, one of our robots in a project led by Nick Halls called Bob is currently in the library every day, making lots of new friends, and you can find all about it. You can follow it on Twitter, and you can also actually just, if you're in the university, go over and meet Bob yourself. The work that I'm going to do, and this is really a thank you at the beginning, is largely funded. We have a variety of funders, but it's largely funded by the European Commission. And I just really want to thank them publicly, both in this hall, and also hello to everybody watching this on the internet, however many there are of you. Hopefully it's more than 5. And really thank them, because they gave a huge shot in the arm to robotics research, not only in Europe, but particularly in Britain. And there would be a relatively small base otherwise. And this has been it's been a game changer for Europe and for Britain in particular. So these are the projects I'm going to talk a little bit about, some of the work. So the reason I called it this is simply because you are all already users of robots, even if you don't know it, and you are going to be much more frequently users of robots in the future. And I figure that that's useful, therefore, to try to explain to you some of the underpinning technology and to give you some sense of what we can do, what we can't do, and what's coming in the future. So the way I want to start is by thinking about robot technology as coming in waves. And I want to think about it as coming in 3 waves. That's an approximation. That's not really the truth. It's a more complex, it's a more nuanced picture than that. But you can think about it as coming in 3 big waves. One's already hit us, and that's this one. And I would refer to it as what I would call structured manipulation. So this is essentially robotics of the kind of automation and robotics that you're probably already familiar with. You think about in car factories, and essentially this is the business of manipulating, changing the world under controlled conditions, under certain conditions. So your arm goes down, it picks up your car door, it puts it on the car, and that car door has to be in exactly the same place every time, otherwise the whole system's going to go wrong. Okay? And that's what you don't want that. You want high production standards, etc. And so what you want is certainty. And position-controlled robots really achieve that. And that was a revolution in manufacturing. There used to be 30,000 people in Longbridge who used to make cars not using robots, and they're not there anymore. And one of the major reasons is because that company didn't stay with that revolution fast enough. Wave 2, however, is hitting us right now. And wave 2 is really what I would say, it's about taking away structure. So it's about taking away these carefully controlled conditions that you have in factories, and instead what you're doing is you're enabling your robots to mix with people, to move around in the world, in our world, and to therefore deal with all of the uncertainty and all of the change that comes with that. But at the moment, the wave that's hitting us is all really about mobility. And there's a very good reason for that, which we'll get to later in the lecture. Probably the point at which I think most people woke up to the fact that robots were really beginning to do something new was in 2005, when a robot called Stanley this was a project led by DARPA, and then in America, and Sebastian Thrun was the leader of this particular project, drove itself across 132 miles of the Mojave Desert, okay, autonomously. It knew roughly the course it had to follow, but it was essentially doing it. If you look at the top of the car, it's a little bit blurred in that image right now, it uses lasers to find its way, and it uses lasers to tell the distance and to tell what's on the road and what's not on the road. And this robot was able to cover some really, really tough terrain. And for the first time, you could really concretely see that robots could go out into a demanding environment and deal with uncertainty. Another really nice example is from our own project, Strands. And this is Bob. So Bob is a security guard robot some of the time. And this is Bob at G4S, the security company in Tewkesbury. And one of the key things about Bob is that in order to be able to move around in the world, the robot has to have a map. And this is the first thing that I'm really going to try to explain to you. And I'm really going to try and teach you something, which is that if you have a map and you want your robot to move around in it, that robot has to know where it is. So now people don't often do this in inaugurals, but I've decided that since we've got a wide public audience and a lot of different levels of expertise, I'm going to have to bring all the members of the public and the non-experts up to the level of the computer scientists in one specific thing, which is how to find out if you're a robot where you are, and we're going to do it in 5 minutes. So this is the question that any mobile robot has to be able to answer. where am I? Because if you don't know where you are, you can't know where you're going. So here's our robot. And what we're going to do is we have a problem called the kidnapped robot problem. So this is where you switch your robot off, or you blindfold it, and you hide it somewhere in a world, and it's got a map of that world. So first we're going to talk about, you have a map of the world, and you want to know where you are in that map. So we've kidnapped the robot, and now what we're going to do is we've kidnapped it, and imagine that it's somewhere in this lecture theatre underneath one of your seats. Okay? So that's the lecture theatre over on the right. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of different algorithms, and in order to do them, I'm going to get you to be the algorithm. So, audience participation, always good. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get you all to stand up in a moment, and then I'm going to make a series of statements about where the robot, some information, I'm going to give you some information about where the robot might be. And wherever you're standing, if the statement that I make is true of you, stay standing. If it's not true of you, sit down. And once you're sitting down, stay sitting down. And don't worry about what people around you are doing. Just make your own mind up as to what you should do, okay? I don't want communicative, has to be independent inference here. And to that end, one of the things I'm going to make you do is I'm going to make you all close your eyes. So, stand up, please. So, excellent. So, and when you've sat down, obviously you're going to stay sitting down, so then you can open your eyes. Right, excellent. So, where is the robot? Everyone close your eyes, and I'm going to tell you some facts. Okay, first of all, if you are in roughly the first 7 rows of the lecture theatre, stay standing up. Otherwise, sit down. Okay. Keep your eyes closed. Okay, next. If you are roughly on the left-hand side of the lecture theatre, Jonathan, my brother, stop looking, close your eyes, you stay standing up. If you're roughly on the left-hand side of the lecture theatre, stay standing up. If you're on the right, sit down. Okay, good. Oh, this is working. This is working much better than I thought it would. If you are in the first 3 rows of the theatre, you can sit down. If not, remain standing. And finally, if there are at least 6 seats, you think, between you and the wall on your left, stay standing up. Otherwise, if you think you're closer to the wall than that, you can sit down. You've got to do some guessing here. Right, the remaining people can open your eyes. So let's see how we did. So you should roughly be the red patch. That's actually pretty good. So, and there's a little, I like this because there's a little bit of noise in there. So some people are a little bit uncertain as to where they should be. So you can all sit down. Thank you very much indeed. So that was our first algorithm for localizing robots given imprecise information. And just to go through this, so what we've got here is you started off, so the red squares in this algorithm denote all the possible places that the robot can be. And then that's what we're going to refer to as your belief. So initially you didn't know where the robot was. It could have been anywhere, under any of the seats. And then we had some information, some data. And I asked you to say, well, was that data true if the robot was where you were? And so what that marked out was a red area, which was now possible, and a white area, which was not possible for the robot to be. And we'll think about that as our data. And then what happened was we combined our belief and our data. And then we iterated. So I gave you, then you get a new belief about the world. And then what happens is we saw some new data, which was a new question. Are you in the left-hand side? And then that then changed our belief. And the key thing here is that as you add information, you're not really in any of the questions, you're not providing very much information, but the point is that as you update your beliefs, you actually become pretty sure about where the robot is. So the idea is that you can combine imprecise information iteratively and fold it in order to kind of work out where things are. And that's a really important principle. However, there's a better way of doing this. Now, one of the things that happened was that some people I could see were sort of hesitating. They weren't sure as to whether they should stand up or sit down. So it would be nice to be able to capture that. I mean, I deliberately made you think about this by closing your eyes so you couldn't look around and get precise results. So that introduced noise into the sensing, as it were, which is exactly the problem that we have with robots. Well, we need to deal with that sensing noise problem. So how are we going to do that? How do we deal with uncertainty in our sensing? Well, what we do is we're going to have a different algorithm. Now, this one's harder, and this is where I've kind of broken tradition. In inaugurals, you don't generally teach things that are actually on the curriculum. And this may either work or it may be a complete disaster, but we'll see. So hold on and pay attention. Let's suppose that instead of just saying yes or no, so yes was standing up, no was sitting down, right? The information was true of me or it was not true of me. Instead of saying that, suppose you could quantify how confident you were in whether or not this statement was true about you. Okay, well let's imagine then, instead of giving yes or no, you could give an answer, a number, and the number, let's suppose the number is a number between 1 and 0. So 1 would correspond to, yeah, I'm completely confident, 0 would, that I should stand up, 0 would be no, and then suppose you were 50-50, well then it would be, you know, you'd have the number, you'd maybe give me back the number 0.5. So that would be more information there, and what we would have done is we would have quantified your degree of uncertainty about whether or not this statement was true of you. So let's have a look here. So what we've now got is this is what we might see as our data now, except that what we strictly are going to do is we're going to have two kinds of information now. And this is where things get a little bit hard. So you have an initial belief. And now we're going to have to change the way we think about representing where the robot is, because we've changed the way we're representing our data. And now this belief is going to be, it's a big table, and it's also going to have to be full of numbers. And these numbers are again going to be numbers between 0 and 1. But let's suppose that there are 400 seats in this lecture theatre, therefore there's 400 possible places that the robot might be. Okay? So each square, if you believe it's equally likely to be under any of the seats, should have a probability that's 1 over 400. So in other words, you just write 1 over 400 in every single one of those little squares. And a key point about that is that representation of uncertainty about where the robot is, all those numbers, clearly, they must add up to 1. And that's make it what we call, for those of you who really don't know about these things, a probability distribution. And that's going to be critical. So we represent our belief, our uncertainty about the world using a probability distribution. So it's just a big lookup table with numbers in it between 0 and 1, and they must sum up to 1 over all the possibilities. And then our data, well, I've already explained that. Strictly, it's not data, it's more the data likelihood, because what we've got here is we've got maybe in some squares the probability of saying, well, I was in the first 7 rows. If you're in the 3rd row, might be 9 out of 10. And then it might be a half as you get closer to the midpoint. And then once you're over into the back of the theatre, you should be pretty confident that it can even be 0, in which case we wipe out those possibilities completely. So now we've got 2 tables full of numbers. And what we want to do is we want to combine them. So how are we going to combine them in order to revise our belief with this new algorithm? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take one number from one table and one number from the other table. So this is our belief, where we thought the probability for the robot initially, and then this is going to be the likelihood of the data. So in other words, how confident you were in answering yes to the question. And all we do is we just take those 2 numbers and we multiply them together, and we put them into a new table in the corresponding cell. So this would be way up here. So if I picked this one and this one, I'd take their product and I'd put them in that cell, and then I'd do the same for this and take their product and put it in there. And then what I've done is I've multiplied a probability distribution, all these numbers, by some other numbers, most of which are less than 1. So now it's the case that in this new table, if I took all the numbers and summed them up, they wouldn't sum to 1 anymore. And we need to turn this back into a distribution. So we do a very simple step, which is called normalization. And what we do is we simply add up the numbers in the whole table, we get a total, and then we go through and we redivide every number by that total. And that will raise all of these numbers by just enough that it turns back into a probability distribution. So the neat thing that we've done, if you didn't follow the precision of that explanation, is basically we've taken an initial belief, combined it with some data, quantified our uncertainty, and we've come back here and we've got a new belief, which is now slightly tighter. This belief over here is it's ever so slightly pink, because we're very uncertain about where we are. We can only have we only have one, probability 1. The robot must be somewhere, and so what we're going to do is we have to spread it out. So if you want to think about this in an analogy, think about it as it's like a big piece of bread, and you've got a unit amount of jam, and you spread your jam all over your bread, and because you don't start with very much jam and your bread's quite big, it's spread very thinly. And then what's going to happen is now, as we run this procedure iteratively, our jam is magically going to kind of scooch up into a particular place on the bread, which is where our robot's going to be. So we get a new belief, and then we go back and we do this again. So we get a new set of data likelihoods, and then we put them together into a new probability distribution, which now, as you see, becomes redder as we become more concentrated. We become more certain about where the robot is. Now, this is an algorithm that's fundamentally, in some sense, different from the previous algorithm, because what we're doing here is we're quantifying the unreliability of the information. So we've done an awful lot of work there, and what have we really achieved? Well, if we think about it, that's what we've got now as where we think the robot is, and that's what we had with the old algorithm. Now, you might not think that that's much of a difference, but in fact it turns out to be critical, and it turns out to be critical for this reason, and really in this reason alone, which is that if your sensor went wrong with this algorithm, such that you eliminated all of the possibilities in the red area and you picked one of the possibilities in the white area instead, your robot would end up having contradictory beliefs, essentially. It would end up concluding that there was nowhere that it could possibly be, or that it was in the wrong place. And at that point, your robot's going to break down and it's not going to work anymore. So quantifying uncertainty has practically, technically, in engineering terms, been a really good idea for the performance of robots. Now, you might be surprised, some of you, to learn that the person who came up with the basic underpinning idea that I've really just explained to you was a 17th century English vicar. This chap, a guy called Tom Bayes. And I don't know what he did in his theological career, but in his scientific career, he wrote one paper, but it was a doozy. So it was a paper on conditional probabilities, essentially, and in it, he derived a rule which is essentially a very simple version. It's the first step, in a sense, of the rule that I've just showed you. Okay? So actually, we've gone beyond Bayes here, and it's called that rule is called Bayes' rule, and it's a way of combining belief with evidence. And what we did there was we iteratively combined Bayes' belief with evidence, and that gave us a sequence of beliefs, and that's what we call it recursive Bayesian estimation. So I think I've got through that part. That's probably the trickiest part of the lecture, to try to explain clearly to a non-specialist. So if you've got that and you go away thinking it's not just all about jam, then well done. If you think it's all about jam, that's fine too, okay, because it is basically about jam. So this guy really had a profound effect on probability theory, on statistics, and also much more recently on artificial intelligence. Now, probabilities, as one of my mentors, Aaron Sloman, often reminds me, and he's right, are not the answer to everything, but they have given us a great deal of power, and I want to talk to you a little bit about some of that power now. There are various algorithms. So I showed you a very simple algorithm there. There's another algorithm. This is called a particle filter, and this is an algorithm where basically, rather than thinking about every possibility, what we do is we move the possibilities around. So the possibilities now become particles. And what happens is the robot gathers information. So here you can see it's got uncertain sensing, which is quite unreliable. As the robot becomes more certain about where it is, this cloud of particles gathers in. And it might maintain multiple hypotheses, quite different places about where it might be, until it gets enough evidence to conclude that it's more or less in one place. But it's able not only to say where it thinks it's most likely to be, it's able to quantify the uncertainty about where it is. And that turns out to be critical. In fact, with Bayes and with many other methods for statistical machine learning, so there's been really big progress in machines that learn from data in the last 15 years, we're able to do things that are much more powerful. So rather than just getting the robot to figure out where it is, using this kind of statistical machine learning, including methods based on Bayes, but others as well, we're now able to also do things like actually learn the map that the robot's going to localize in. And here's a really nice example of this. So this is some work from a friend of mine, a guy called Paul Newman. If you Google him, he's the second Paul Newman on the internet, which is good. And this is an algorithm that learns the appearance of places. So what you do is you have a camera on top of your car. It's a surround camera. And then it learns the statistics of the images in such a way that when you drive back down the same road, it will be able to recognize where it is. And so what they did was and it's using this kind of Bayesian machine learning. And so these yellow tracks are them taking various routes with the car, driving it down all the country roads of Oxfordshire, and every time you see a red dot, that's the car recognizing that it's been there before. Okay? And this is a hard problem. So and actually we solved this a while ago. So this goes back to 2007. And it's really nice. And it works not perfectly, but it works pretty reliably. So over 1,000 kilometers, it recognized that it was in the same place again around 2,500 times and only got it wrong 3 times. And this picture is a really nice story about what you can do with these kinds of machine learning methods. You can cope with a great deal of change and uncertainty. The picture at the top is when the robot first encountered it. So, or when the car, because it's driven by a human, it's not an autonomous car. That was what the picture when it first encountered it, but it recognized it as the same place in the bottom picture, even though there's this huge advertising hoarding that appears instead. So it's able, these kinds of algorithms are now able to deal with really quite large changes in the data, quite large amounts of uncertainty, and that's fantastic for structure, for unstructured mobility. However, if you want to be autonomous, you don't just want to know something about the world and know how uncertain you are, you also need to be able to plan. And if you've got uncertainty in the world, you want to plan taking into account your uncertainties, right? So that's also an area where we've made some more progress, although this it turns out to be a very hard problem indeed. This is a section of the MIT campus from the air. And a guy called Nick Roy, who works in this area, he came up with a really nice way of getting, if you imagine you had a robot that had to get from one part of the campus to another, and what happens is that the robot localizes itself. In this case, it doesn't localize itself visually. What it's going to do is it's going to use radio beacons to tell, which are dotted around the campus, and it can measure the distance to the radio beacons effectively. And that means it's going to know roughly where it is, but some parts of the campus don't have many radio beacons. So its uncertainty, if it travels through those parts of the campus, rises quite quickly. So if you start at some point A and you wanted a plan to get to some place B, so here's the map again. So this is where it starts. And if the robot just tried to take the shortest path to get to this point, this is the route it ought to take. Okay, so that's what traditional robot route planning would do. Now, the green circles are the uncertainty in its position that it predicts that it will have because there's not many radio beacons in that northern part of the campus. So what's happening, if intuitively, is think about when you go driving and you're driving in a slightly unfamiliar place, or you're in a city that you haven't been in for very long. What you might well be tempted to do is to say, well, I want to get from A to B, and I think there might be a quick route this way, but do you know what? I know this safe route. There's a route that I'm familiar with that gets me most of the way, and it's longer, but that would be more reliable. I'm more likely to get there without getting lost. And in fact, that's what this algorithm does. So he has an algorithm that essentially what it does is it plans a route taking account of the information that the robot's likely to pick up as it goes along, the effect that that's going to have on its uncertainty about where it is, and it says, well, I don't just want to go on the quickest route, I want to go on the safest route. So now what you're doing is you're planning, taking into account the uncertainty that you have right now, and also the information that you're going to pick up as you move through the world. And this is a tremendously hard problem. And I believe that this problem is absolutely fundamental to building successful autonomous agents. And this was actually where I started my PhD, with a slightly different twist, which is that here, the only task is to get from A to B. And actually, we can think about task in a slightly different way. And we can think about it using a notion from psychology, which is the notion of learning from rewards. So if you want to not route plan, but you want to learn, you can think about learning from rewards. So here we've got what we call in reinforcement learning a two-armed bandit. So imagine you go to a casino, and there's this machine in front of you, and you can play a game with it. You can pull the left arm, and you might get a reward of 10p, or you can pull the right arm, and you can get a reward of 10p. Okay? But the arms are unreliable. You don't always get money back. All right? And the thing is, the arms are reliable to different extents. So one of the arms is likely to give you reward more frequently than the other. But you've got to find out which. And you've only got a limited amount of time to play the game. So, I need a volunteer. Oh, come on, Andy. Excellent. Good man. There we are. So, what we're going to do is we're going to... so this is Andy Pryke. So he's a former colleague of mine. So good to see you. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do is you get to choose which arm you want to pull, and we're going to pull one or other of the arms 15 times, and I'm going to tell you whether you won or lost. Okay. Okay, so which arm do you want to pull first, left or right? You want to go left. Okay, you just won. Okay. Left or right?
I'll do it right then.
You're going to do it right. You lost.
I'll do it left.
You lost.
I'll do it right.
Oh, you won. You won.
I'll do a left.
You won again.
I'm tempted to stick, you know. I'll try one right.
You won again. You're a lucky man. My pseudo-random number generator didn't know you were this good.
I'll do a left.
Sorry?
I'll do a left.
You do a left. So, oh, you lost.
And a right.
You lost.
And yeah, a left I think is best at the moment.
Okay, you lost again.
I'll do a right.
You lost again.
Another right then.
You lost again.
No 15 yet.
You're getting close. You're on 12.
I'll do another left.
Oh, you won.
Right. And another left.
Yep. You won again.
I'm going to stick with left.
And you won again. Thank you very much. So you got back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 80p. I'll give that to you later. So you kept on putting. So tell me, what was your strategy?
Well, initially I chose randomly. Well, I chose alternatively. That was easier.
Right.
I didn't know which was better than the other.
Right.
But then I seemed to be accumulating more on the left. So I thought I'll do slightly more lefts because it's probably the better one. But I might just be unlucky on the right. So I kept going 2 rights. That was my thinking process, although it did turn out to be a lot of alternates.
Yeah, you did.
I was trying to count how many I got for each and roughly bias my choice left or right.
Okay.
How accurate, how wide that was.
Okay. So that's quite an advanced strategy. You'll be pleased to know that you've managed to equal an expert in this task. Incidentally, you had a 70% chance, so you did pick the right arm. So you did, they were generated. They were really random. These chaps, it turns out that you're just as good as the blue tits. So the, sorry. I'm glad it wasn't my boss who volunteered. So the thing with, so back in the 1960s, animal behaviorists were able to study sort of these kind of reward learning tasks with animals, and there's a very long history of this. And with what they showed was with blue tits, where you have like 2 possible reward sources and they're variable and they each have a different level of success or a rate of return. What happens actually, so the blue tits actually what they do typically, or one of the strategies that they seem to employ, is they sample each arm they have a fixed sort of sampling for a while on this arm and then on this arm, and then what they do is they then exploit the arm for a while, they'll exploit the arm for the rest of the trial that turns out to be the best in that sample. So what they're doing is they're building up a picture, they're building up information, so they're exploring the world, and then they're exploiting the information that they've got. And this trade-off between exploring, gathering information, and exploiting the information that you've got is absolutely fundamental to being any kind of creature embodied in the world. And that's what we need our robots to do. And it turns out that these kinds of exploration exploitation problems you can use to study all kinds of other behaviors. So one way that we gather information in the world is we use our eyes. So this is a picture of using an eye tracker of people making a sandwich, a peanut butter and jam sandwich, or if you're American, peanut butter and jelly. And what they're doing is it's the sequence of eye movements that they make around the scene. So what you do is you look for the jam jar, you pick it up, you get your knife, you look for that, you go in, you have a look, you find the bread, and so on and so forth. And even as I'm imagining doing the task, I look at these imaginary places, right, in order to gather information, in order to make my actions more reliable. And that's essentially what you're doing. Your eyes lead your hands. And what your eyes are doing is they're gathering information that's useful for your task. So if you thought about your task in terms of rewards, what's happening is that your eyes are solving the kind of the exploration problem in order to help the hands, which are then doing some exploitation in this case. And one of the models that we came up with, in fact, so we came up with a model because we wanted to do this in the robots. So we had a simulated robot. So one of my PhD students, Jose Nunes Rivera, what we did was we looked at a planning algorithm that was capable of planning how the eye should actively gather information in order to help the hands be as effective as possible in this task of clearing up the table and putting things into the containers on either side. And weirdly, so what happens is that the way to reward the eyes is that the hands get rewarded for doing the task. And then the eyes get a sort of a copy reward, which is a thank you from the hands. And the amount of reward that the cameras should get in our algorithm is precisely the difference between how well the hands would have done without their help and how well the hands do with their help. Right? So it's like a kind of a thank you reward for, oh, thank you for helping me be better, and I'll tell you how much better I was. And that way the eyes can then learn, or in our case, plan how to gather the information. So this is a really neat way of solving it. Now, of course, it turns out, and maybe some of you will not be surprised to hear this, that actually you can use this algorithm not just in a robot or a simulated robot, but in fact you can show that it matches under certain circumstances human data. So there's a task that was done in 2001, and we were able to show that the algorithm from the robot did the same sequence of eye movements as the humans in the task. So that was quite nice. So this idea of actively gathering information is really important. But let's think about now a more complex task. So one of the projects that I worked on for a long time with Nick and with other people was a project called CogX. And there we were, for some reason, or I was for some reason, obsessed with this task. Getting the robot to get you a box of cornflakes. Now, why anyone would want to build a cornflakes fetching robot, I don't know, but that was what we decided to do. And the reason was that we thought it was about the level that we could pitch to try to get the robot to sort of plan how to gather the information it needed to do to do its task, while also it's a task that's quite hard, because what we have to do is, in order to make some sense of this task, we have to introduce now not just uncertainty, but common sense. And what happens is that when you start off, the robot doesn't know anything much about this specific world. So it says, well, I don't know where the cornflakes are. I'm going to have to figure out where they are. And so now it's an active information gathering problem. Where should it go in order to find those cornflakes? So what we do is we give the robot some general knowledge. And this is the kind of general knowledge that we have. So it turns out to be a kind of, if you looked inside the robot's brain, you have a network, and you have things like, for example, there's an office, and there's a kitchen, and there's information, there's general purpose information about the world, such as there are particular types of rooms, and then there's there's also information about the world, such as, for example, there are particular types of objects like milk or cornflakes, and you typically find them in kitchens rather than in offices. And we make some of that information certain, and we make some of that information uncertain, and we try to find the probabilities to say how likely is it you're going to find cornflakes in my office by mining the web and then sort of doing image searches so that we kind of get some kind of COD probabilities. So that's kind of a hack, but it's a neat way of using what's out there, data out there on the web, in order to give some quantification of the degree of association between two ideas. And so then what we can do is this robot, this is its kind of general purpose knowledge up here, and this is knowledge about a specific place that it's in. So it's in a room which has a particular appearance, and what it wants to do is it wants to perform some task, and it needs to now use its general knowledge to help guide its actions in this specific world. And that general knowledge is also going to have some uncertainty into it. And so the kinds of plans that the robot comes up with are something like this. I know what I'll do. I know that you typically find cornflakes boxes in kitchens. So what I'll do, and with some likelihood, sometimes people are really messy and they leave them in the living room. I don't know, maybe if they're students or they're busy or something. And then I'll say, well, so what I'll do is I'll search for a room that looks like a kitchen, and then when I get there, if I find a kitchen, because I don't know what the room layout is, once I find something that looks like a kitchen, I'll actually search the room really thoroughly. And that will be a quick way of doing it, rather than just searching randomly around everywhere. And that's exactly what it does. And to do this, it has to be able to have a recognizer for the type of room that it's in. And that's exactly what it has. So this was our postdoc and colleague now, Mark Hanheider, and he unfortunately tortured his poor wife and child with the robot in their house for several weeks. And this was when he's told the robot to go and find a box of, I think it's Frosties, actually. And so what happens is the robot figures out pretty quickly that this is a living room. And you can see that there because this big pie chart, sort of the beige bit, shows that it thinks it's a living room. And over here, the red bit says it's a kitchen. And when it goes into the kitchen, it recognizes it visually as a kitchen. It says, oh, wow, fantastic, I'm in the kitchen now. But it only goes to the kitchen not knowing that it's going to be a kitchen. It says, well, it's just the room that's most likely to be a kitchen, that one over there. So it's already got a map, but it doesn't know the categories of the rooms. And then it plans how to search that space. And then here it is going and finding that Frosties box at the end. So, and what's happening here is that the robot is also reasoning not only about the likelihoods of where you might leave things, but also about the reliability or the unreliability of its visual sense. So, one of the things I'm really proud of is this graph. Why am I proud of this graph? So this is our clever system, and this is the amount of time that the robot spent searching for this damn cornflakes box. And then over here, this is a sort of a slightly dumber algorithm. So it sort of halves the time. And we did this in several environments, and the data point that I'm really proud of is that one up there. So this is the clever system, and it took longer than any of the other runs. So why am I really proud of this? Because what happened was the following. It started in the living room, went, right, okay, this looks like a living room. I know, I'll go and try and find a kitchen. found a kitchen. So this looks like a kitchen. I'll search it. Searched it, looked right at the cornflakes box. Computer vision failed, which it often does, and looked right at it, didn't see it. I went, oh, that's really odd. Well, I know there's some probability that they're messy, so there's some likelihood they just left it lying around in the living room. So went back, searched the living room, couldn't find it because it wasn't there, and then went, oh, that's still really odd. Well, I suppose, and it has some probability that it knows its visual system has failed. And so then what it does is it then goes, okay, well, maybe my visual system failed. So it went back to the kitchen and looked again. So it took ages, but it eventually found the cornflakes box. Now, I love this because this is what I do when I can't find my keys in the morning. Which is basically, if you don't trust your visual system, if you don't trust your sensing system, what you should do is look again in the same place, presuming that things are, the trials are independent. So I'm really proud of that. However, we went further. There, the robot had a map. It just didn't know the categories of the rooms. Suppose we took away its map. And we said, now, when you're in a new building, if I told you, many of you came here for the first time, you had to find your way here, you did sort of an exploration, but you're building up the map while you're trying to find this particular place. You ask people, you get information as you go, you look for signs and so on and so forth. So wouldn't it be great if we could get the robot to do that? Well, this is what we did. And if you take away the robot's map, now there's a lot of aspects of the world which are unknown. And what happens is that now the robot, in order to proceed, is going to have to make assumptions. And it's going to have to make assumptions about the world in order to be able to perform its task. So if we take away the map, now what the robot has to do is it says, well, you've told me to find some cornflakes. Well, I know they're typically in kitchens. So why not let's assume that there's a kitchen in this place, and I'll go and try and find that room. So I'm going to imagine the existence of something that I don't initially know about. And then what I'll do is I'll then search, and then I'll go and look for this room, and I'm going to build up my map as I go along, and then when I find something that looks right, I will then go and search it. And this is really quite fundamentally different. So this is in AI is what's known as open world planning rather than closed world planning. So in open world planning, new pieces, not just new information about existing objects, but new objects can turn up in the world that you didn't know about before. And in order to plan in such circumstances, you have to have imagination. You have to be able to plan thinking about the things that you might need. But it only imagines the right things. There's lots of things that the robot could imagine, but it doesn't imagine anything. It imagines specifically the things that it needs in order to be able to do its task. So the planner actually figures out what it needs to imagine in order to be able to perform this task. And that's really neat. I'm really proud of that. So the people who really pushed a lot of this work, and particularly in terms of the planning, were Moritz Gerbelbacher and Charles Gretton, and thank you to them. So when you get now, what we've actually done in this one is it's not searching for a cornflakes box, it's searching for a copy of AI magazine. It's a magazine about robots. I don't know, that's maybe the way the robot likes it. And so what happens is now it's planning a visual search. So this is its map from above, and you can see it builds up a very complicated map. It's full of like surfaces, these are the tables. These kind of strange purple pyramids are where it's thinking about looking, and you can see that magazine, and it's going to find it eventually. And what it's doing, but it had to imagine the existence of this particular type of room in order to be able to do its plan, and it finds it. However, what we can do is we can trick the robot. We can hide the magazine. So we can now put it somewhere, and now we make the robot fail. And what you want your robots to do, if they're going to be useful in the world, is when they fail, which robots do all the time, I can assure you, when they fail, you would like them to be able to explain their failure. You would like them to be able to come up with some explanation of what happened, and then maybe to test that explanation, because that's something a little bit like what we do. You create a story about what went wrong, and then you try to test whether your story was right. And we've all done that when things go wrong in our lives. We think, well, what if only if I'd done something, or maybe it was like this. So this is what we did. So we gave it this kind of copy of the magazine, and then we hid it. And we hide it in this little sort of cupboard down here. And so now when it goes and searches the room, obviously it's not going to be able to find the thing because we've hidden it. And it goes, oh, that's really odd. And so it reverts to its first strategy. It says, well, maybe you've left it somewhere else. So it goes back to the office, has a look around there. So it searches for the object for a while, gives up in this particular room, says, oh, that's no good. I know, I'll go back to the office and have a look there. And then goes into the office, has a look around there as well, and actually fairly rapidly now gives up. Because it says, well, I've done a really thorough search. This is really odd.
Plan execution failed unexpectedly. I'm searching for an explanation now.
And
My task failed.
and tries to find an explanation for the failure. And this is how long it takes.
I have now found a possible explanation for the failure. Perhaps the magazine is in a container which has been moved to which is most likely a meeting room.
So it expresses it slightly strangely, but it figures it out. Now, obviously what we've done is we've created a kind of a domain here where we've obviously told it about the things that we want it to reason about. And so it's able to come up with this explanation. And it comes up with it in the form, I would say, of a story. And then what it does is it also plans to go and verify the story with a person. So now, and it's using assumptions at every single stage. So what happens is it comes and finds somebody, and we don't do speech recognition here. We actually type it, but we type natural language, very simple natural language, into a GUI.
Is there a container in this room? Okay. Are magazines typically in containers?
It's a very strange robot.
Are containers typically in meeting rooms? Is there a magazine in the container? Okay. I finished my task successfully.
So the robot's happy when it's found an explanation and it can verify it with a person. And what it's doing is it's constructing a narrative, because it says, look, maybe the world was different to the way I expected it to be. I mean, it's a pretty strange narrative, let's face it. But, you know, that was what we came up with. But the point is quite general, which is that the robot, oh yes, the robot often frequently goes wrong. What happens is that the robot's constructing a narrative, a story, using assumptions and saying, well, maybe there were some other objects in the world that I didn't know about, and maybe that explains why my data was unlikely. And it comes up with some really interesting explanations, and in fact, it ranks them by how likely they are. So each assumption has a probability, so it costs you something, and then what it does is it tries to find the sequence of assumptions that makes it most likely. So it likes only to make a few assumptions. If you have to make lots of assumptions, it's complicated, so it's an unlikely world. So it's using probabilities here as well to decide on the story that it tells in order to explain why it failed, and then it assumes that it can find a person to go and explain. This is really where I want to end in terms of unstructured mobility. There's a third wave. We've actually made a lot of progress in unstructured mobility. If you really want cornflakes finding robots, we've got it. But what we're really struggling with is manipulation. So manipulation, once you take the robot out of the car factory and you introduce lots of uncertainty, that manipulation suddenly becomes incredibly difficult. This is a really nice video of a robot that we worked on in one project called GERT with friends at the German Aerospace Research Centre. It's called Justin, and it's one of the world's most expensive robots. It's extremely nice. And this, I think, €500,000 robot is its most famous task for a long time. It does lots of things. It's a really, really cool system. Was to make essentially a drink. It's a more or less undrinkable drink, actually. And when we were presented with this, they said, well, look, what we have to do is every time we have to do this task, picking up the jar, picking up the glass of water to pour the water into the cup and so on and so forth, we find that we have to reprogram the robot completely, because it's programmed for every different, not just every different object, but every different combination of objects. Well, that's not really dealing with a lack of structure. So instead what we want to do is we want to get our robots to learn how to grasp things. And I'm just going to go back and explain something for 1 second. So in the next slide, what I'm going to show you is an algorithm that we've developed here, or the results of it, where we can get our robot to learn how to grasp something or where to put its fingers on something in order to grasp it, and it does it from one trial. So when you learned as a baby how to pick up stuff, you did hundreds and thousands of trials. And what we're going to do is we're going to do it in one trial. So you show an object, and you show it how to grasp that object, and then you can show it a new object, which it's never seen before, and it will adapt the grasp to this new object. And the objects that you adapt it to can be quite different. Imagine the first object was a really different shape to that toothpaste tube. And this is work that's been led by Marek Kapitsky, who's in the audience. And here's the latest thing, which has not been shown many times before in the world. This is now we also do this problem of grasp selection. So we teach the robot 5 different grasps, and we're able to pick up about 45 different objects that are completely new to it. We can't do full manipulation. We can only do the grasping. But in my mind, this is a good step forward in terms of generalizing grasping, taking manipulation, grasping under lack of structure, grasping when things are novel. And here's Boris. Now you're going to see that people who are physically here are going to be able to see Boris actually running, showing adaptation of one particular grasp over in the lab later on. So, what's coming next? What we've done here is we've really focused on uncertainty, and that's really my specialism. Actually, this isn't entirely the right way to do things, and we're still using position-controlled robots but trying to cope with an unstructured world. The way things are going to go is like this. This is work by a friend of mine, Jan Peters, and it's a table tennis playing robot, and it learns how to play table tennis from examples. And it's a really interesting example of the kind of task that roboticists are now really beginning to tackle. It's not the best table tennis player in the world, but it learns from relatively few trials. So you stand behind it with a bat and you show it how to play table tennis. And in this trial, what it's also doing is it's learned how the other player plays. So it adjusts, it does shot prediction, it's predicting what the shot that the human opponent is playing. It's certainly not up to human standards, but it's really impressive. And what this is doing is now it's applying machine learning, that's robotics, but what's happening is that people, including some of my colleagues here, are going back and thinking about now robotics not in terms of position control, so sort of timid grasping where you work everything out, but really going back and controlling the dynamics of the robot, really thinking about the forces. And that's not the way we've traditionally done things. So the robotic hardware that we've been using has been rather different. A good example, so my colleague Mike Mystery is in the audience. This is some of, I hope you don't mind me showing this, Mike. So this is some work that Mike did when he was a PhD student with some other people at the University of Southern California. And it's a really good example of how once you've got an idea where you want to put your feet, what happens is the robot figures out what's called an inverse dynamics problem. So this isn't, I don't think this is using learning, but what's happening is that the robots, so a lot of what Mike's work is about figuring out how the robot should apply the forces on its feet in order to be able to cover unpleasant terrain. And if you do this, you can really begin to cope with some very, very nasty environments by actually beginning to reason directly about dynamics. That's the way that things are going to go in the future. If you want to think about manipulation, actually, manipulation problems are a lot more like that walking problem, where you've got multiple contacts with the world, and you want to change your position relative to the world, or you want to change the pose of the object in your hand. Those are the problems, the really big problems that we don't know how to solve yet. However, once we can do unstructured manipulation, everything's going to change. I mean, if you think at the moment by watching the news that there's a robot revolution going on, and there is, in terms of unstructured mobility, you wait till we can do manipulation even remotely, I mean, even 10% of the manipulative capabilities of humans. It's going to be really hard, but we are going to get there. I don't know when we're going to get there. So what are the applications? Think about things that are happening right now. These are not coming soon, actually. This is here right now. So this is a warehousing system run by a combination of people and robots. The robots and the people are kept relatively separate. It's a company called Kiva Systems, and they were bought by Amazon, and Amazon now use a mixture of people and robots in their warehouses, and what happens is the robots bring the goods to the people who will do the picking. If you can crack the picking problem, then you can have an entirely lights-out warehouse. So what's going to happen is that tasks like this in logistics are rapidly becoming roboticized, and they're not the traditional kind of structured tasks that we see in manufacturing. So it's going to have a huge impact. It really is. Another example, which I love, is this movie from Google. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but let me play it for you again and think about the possibilities. The thing that really strikes me is when you realize that guy's blind. And you think about what you can do if you can bring robots into a world that can cope with that lack of structure. The things that they can do for people who couldn't do stuff before. Imagine people who can't walk, who can now have literally an extra pair of an exoskeleton to help them walk. Imagine people who can't see, who can have new seeing aids. Imagine cars that can drive themselves. Once you've cracked these problems of mobility in unstructured environments, and then in the future manipulation in unstructured environments, many, many things are possible. One of the things that's going to happen, I mean, so this is another good example, finally, just to end on. This is an agricultural example, and it's trying to find real examples of unstructured manipulation right now is hard because we haven't really solved the problems. But here's a really nice example of how you can do a lot with not very much. So this is a robot plant pot mover. And what it does is when you have these big warehouses or big nurseries, typically during the life of a plant, you might have 1,000 or 10,000 plants in a nursery, and you want to move those pots maybe 15 times during the course of the growing life of that plant. And at the moment, a person has to move all those pots. And it turns out you can do it with robots. And it's a really nice example because the pots are always round and they're always pretty much the same size. So you can achieve a great deal and save a great deal of labor doing that kind of thing. Now, this is going to lead to challenges as well, however, because what's going to happen is just as we automated in manufacturing industry, and that caused a real shift in employment, if we can crack service robots in unstructured environments, we now are going to have the ability to, I would not say automate, but to autonomize lots of these kinds of service industry jobs. That's going to have profound impacts on the way people work and what people do with their lives. And those we need to really think about those because this technology is coming. I don't know how fast it's coming, but it is coming, and it's coming much faster actually than I thought. If you'd have said 10 years ago that we can do the things now that we can do, I would have been really, really surprised. But we still have a lot of things to get right. Autonomy does occasionally go wrong. But often not in the way that we think. And so one of the things I want to end on is often we think about the world in terms of, just as Dora thinks about the world in terms of stories, so we understand our world in terms of stories. And one of the problems for robotics is that actually we have a very long tradition of stories about autonomy gone wrong. You only have to be a theologian, or you don't even have to be a theologian. Go back to Genesis 1, Adam and Eve, given autonomy, made some bad choices, apparently. And that's a really instinctive story for us. And the problem is that when you have stories, you try to fit the world to your stories. And actually the ways that autonomy does present problems, but it doesn't present the problems that I think often in the narratives that we think it does. But the problems that it will pose for us and the opportunities it poses for us will be really unexpected. Okay, I'm going to finish now. I guess in a moment, my predictor tells me there may be a round of applause. I would like that round of applause not to be for the lecture, or not for the lecture alone, but I would like it to be for all of the... Oh, there was one thing. I wanted to say something else, which is think about also these things. Coping with uncertainty, planning ahead, knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. Being optimistic and making assumptions turn out to be good things to do for our robots and explaining failures. They're also all the things that we do in our everyday lives. So maybe our robots, the problems they have to solve are not so different, and maybe we can learn something from the solutions that we find for them. And now I would like you to thank this bunch of people, because that is not everybody, but a very large proportion of the people who have contributed to not only the work I've talked about today, but all of the papers that I've published and the papers that are coming. And these people worked incredibly and do continue to work incredibly hard. So I would like you to put your hands together and thank them. I think we're going to say goodbye to everybody on YouTube. Say bye-bye everyone on YouTube. And I think now...